Today's topic is life-changing events, and I mean uncontrollable acts that dramatically change the course of your life. There are only two kinds. There's acts of God, which are perfect, because God is perfect. And there are acts of man, which are imperfect, because man is sinful. In either case, our human nature drives us to always want to know why. Why did this happen? And the most honest and truthful and God-pleasing answer to why is gained by knowing the Scriptures, both Old Testament, New Testament, and that is law and love. And as a side note, we've had some friends. I have friends in the community that are asking that question, why right now? They lose sons, they lose a grandson, and you are searching when your grandson is stillborn. You're searching for the answer. Why? Why did this happen? And some of these are acts of God, and other are acts of men. When you lose your son at Fuller's, it is life shattering, and you are always trying to figure out why. So I'm not going to focus on the acts of men. I'm really going to talk a little bit today about acts of God. And it's not too hard to discern when you've experienced an act of God. Many are natural, like a tornado, or an earthquake, or a flood, or a fire. Some are health related, like a stroke, or a heart attack, or cancer. Some are miraculous, like manna on the ground, like water from a rock, or the bears making a great tractor. That's the only joke I'll try and throw. It would be miraculous if they made a great tractor. So, in my life, actually, I have several act of God stories that have affected me. And this is not tragic, but these have all led me to actually be here today with you this morning. So at your tables this morning, I encourage you, when we're finished here in a few short minutes, while I finish up my story, I encourage you to think about your own personal act of God's story that resulted in you being either a better husband or a better dad or a better friend. And take some time this morning, think about that and share it. That's the table talk today. Think about the act of God that occurred in your life and how it shaped you. So here's one of mine. As I sat a couple weeks ago and watched the snow fall, the large flakes covering the lawn brought back memories of my early basketball days and dreams. I had just completed my high school basketball career. We were all being recruited. And the guys I competed against, they're all on their way out of town. Robert Byrd was going to Marquette. Larry Jab Williams was going to Louisville. Ronnie Lester was going to Iowa. Marty Murray was going to Western Michigan. And on April 2nd, 1975, so Jamie, now you can do the math, okay? You can, all right? Yeah. Were you born? 8 years ago. Okay, all right. So on April 2nd, 1975, I had my golden ticket in the palm of my hand. It was an airline ticket to New York. I'd been recruited to play college basketball at Army, and that's the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in New York, up on the Hudson River. I was leaving Chicago And I was never looking back. And I was never coming back. Because, you know, when you accept a commission at one of the academies, it involves a 5-year tour of duty afterward, and possibly a life of government service. Certainly, winter wasn't over by the end of March 1975. Seasonal snowfall stood at 42 inches, about normal for Chicago. March had just ended on a high note with a spring-like 62 degrees on the 31st. But early in the morning of April 1st, just as a low pressure was moving across the Rockies, a cold front passed through the city, shifting winds into an ominous northeast direction and sending the mercury plunging down. Just after midnight on April 2nd, a messy mixture of sleet, snow, and freezing rain began, accompanied by occasional bouts of thunder and lightning. Shortly after daybreak, heavy wet snow and a wintry mix of precipitation continued. The storm was rapidly intensifying, and by mid-afternoon, heavy snow, driven by northeast winds, enveloped the entire city, dropping visibility to near zero. Snow piled up at the rate of an inch per hour, snarling traffic and closing O'Hare Airport for only the 3rd time in its history. Expressways were so clogged with the heavy wet snow that motorists were forced to abandon their cars. By the time the snow ended on April 2nd, more than 11 inches lay on the ground at O'Hare. Spring of 1975 was put on hold as cold weather lingered for several days, and the snow did not totally melt until April 11th. My flight, my golden ticket out of here, was scheduled on April 2nd, 1975. And for only the 3rd time in history, Chicago O'Hare was closed due to weather, and I got canceled. Meanwhile, now don't forget, in 1975, not only did we not have the internet, not only did we not have phones, cell phones, not only did we not have laptop computers, we didn't have desktop computers. It was like Fred Flintstone. There was like no communication whatsoever in 1975. Just so that I'm bringing you up to speed on what it was like to live back then, okay? So, pardon me. Meanwhile, late in March 1975, after suffering through a 3-22 season, the Army brass decided to buy up the last year of Dan Doherty's contract and get a new basketball coach. An athletic advisory board was set up to screen applicants, and the phrase young and hungry was thrown around like a beach ball. Mike Krzyzewski was the captain of Army's basketball team in 68 and 69 and remained in the Army, coaching various service teams, the military academy prep team until 1974, when he resigned his commission because he wanted to coach basketball for a living. He went out to Indiana as a graduate student and assistant to Bobby Knight, who was building the Hoosiers into the national champions back then. When the news of the vacancy at Army reached Bloomington, Indiana, Knight and Krzyzewski were sitting in a coach's locker room, and their discussion went, something like this. Knight says, "Are you interested?" And Krzyzewski says, "Yes, I am." How do I go about getting it? Knight explained the benefits and the drawbacks of coaching at West Point, the difficulty in recruiting players to an institution that demands 5 years of postgraduate service, the rigors of coaching players who must wake up at 6 a.m. each morning, and frankly, whose top priority in school is definitely not basketball. This thing is right for me now. I'm the best guy for the job. Who knows West Point better than me? And I'll quit talking like that for out of respect for Coach K. So within the day, Krzyzewski sent in his application. More than 120 people applied for this job. So on paper, Krzyzewski had absolutely no chance whatsoever. He had no college coaching experience, and he had resigned his Army commission. He quit the Army, right? And now he's going to go and apply for the job at the Army. Probably not going to happen. But Krzyzewski had some advocates on this advisory board who remembered him from his playing days. And they persuaded the board to at least interview the kid. And frankly, Krzyzewski made the most of it. He came in with detailed plans for turning the basketball program around. He even brought brochures with him. And he acted as if he already had the job and that the board was his coaching staff. He says it was like scouting an opponent. I think it had to impress them, and it did. So did the fact that Krzyzewski was a West Point graduate. So did the fact that he coached Gary Winton, who at the time was the best basketball player in Army history. Krzyzewski was young and hungry. He was familiar with the coaching situation at West Point. He even convinced the board that the only reason he had resigned his commission was because coaching basketball was his life's goal. And maybe, most of all, he was a product of Bobby Knight, the last man to make West Point a respected basketball team. So by April 15th, Krzyzewski was sitting in the office of the superintendent at the military academy, and the superintendent says, "Okay, coach, let's get going." So he gets the job. And, you know, the rest of Coach K is history. You know that. So, I mean, that's the end of that story, but it's not the end of my story. So what happened to my golden ticket out of town? Meanwhile, the snowstorm that canceled my trip to New York was an act of God. Those 2 weeks of uncertainty in what was happening at Army bought me time to contemplate my future. Frankly, to look in the mirror and get very serious about whether I was, Army material and 5-year and a possible life in the Army. And I changed my mind. So this uncertainty, I had other offers. I took a sure thing. So on the same day, on April 15th, I signed a national letter of intent to enroll at UICC and play basketball for my beloved coach, Ed McQuillan. And it was the first year UICC was eligible to offer NCAA scholarships, and I enthusiastically accepted their first one. On April 16th, when this new first-time head coach Krzyzewski called me to reschedule my snowed-out visit to West Point, I had to decline and inform him that I had already committed to UICC. I might be the very first college basketball recruit to ever turn down Coach K. I'm going to have my kids put that on the side of my gravestone. But look, I've never regretted the decision to turn down an offer from Coach K. I never left Chicago. Through all my businesses I've created and all my world travels, I've never had to relocate. And I thank God for changing the direction of my life, because if that hadn't happened to me, honestly, I wouldn't be here today. I have no idea where I'd be, but I surely wouldn't be here today. So that's my little act of God story that I wanted to share with you. And now it's really, your opportunity. Can you guys identify an uncontrolled, life-changing event that affected you? Was it from God or was it from man? Because there are events that man creates, sinful events that man creates that change your lives, but it's for you to discern that. Why did it happen? And if you're ever searching for why these things happen in our lives, I sincerely encourage you to lean into God and lean into his word, and don't blame him for it, because he's a good God and he's a perfect God. And he has a perfect reason for doing things. A little example from Scripture is that there was a blind man. And the Pharisees wanted to know, Lord, was it this man's parents who sinned, or was it the man himself who sinned to make him blind? And Jesus gives us a little glimpse about these acts of God. He said, no, it was neither their sins that caused this. This man has been blind from birth, so that until the day that I came, people would see and know that I'm God, because I cured his blindness. And it may have taken that man 35 or 40 years to actually come to the reality of why he was blind from birth. It was so that Jesus could make the proclamation of who he was, and he cured the man's blindness. You don't always get the answer right away. And life is very, very painful at times. But I encourage you all to lean into the word. And this kind of fraternity, you have each other to lean into also.